So today, let's talk about the great transformation that we are living today. So in the 2020s, key technologies are converging that will disrupt the 5 foundational sectors of the economy: information, food, energy, transportation, and materials. These are phase change disruptions, and I'll explain what that means. But if all you do is walk away with that concept today, then that is what explains what is going on in the world. And phase change disruptions are happening at all levels: at the product level, at the sector level, at the economy, and even all of society. So I am going to distill 6 publications, books, and reports that I've published over the last few years in this presentation. And I'm going to start with how disruption really works. What are the patterns of change, big change, in transformation? So we live in an equilibrium, meaning let's talk about a sector, for instance. Our electricity grid has been there for about 100 years. And there's been innovation within the grid. There's been new types of electricity generation technologies, but the grid has more or less stayed the same over the last 100 years. So that's an equilibrium. But at the same time as there is an equilibrium in a certain value chain, technologies are improving in cost and capabilities. Every technology is improving, almost every technology is improving in cost and capability at different rates. So solar PV improves at a certain rate, lithium-ion batteries improve at a certain rate, computing improves at a certain rate. And at some point, they converge to open up a vast new possibility space. So what is possible essentially changes, both on the collapse and on the creation side. Everything changes. But the incumbents don't see it. The incumbents don't see it. Entrepreneurs do, artists do, but incumbents don't see it. And entrepreneurs come in. So think about Tesla in 2010, or the solar companies and battery companies that were started around that time, because they saw that possibility space open up. So they come in, they start companies, they develop products and services that improve in cost and capability over the following few years. And at some point, that product or service hits a rupture point. It ruptures that equilibrium. That equilibrium does not exist anymore. The old rules don't apply anymore. Now, the new rules may not be clear, but the old rules don't apply anymore. That's what's happening today in many sectors: in energy, in transportation, in food, and so on. So once we rupture that system, we go into disequilibrium. So the old brakes don't work anymore. And in fact, the old brakes may actually serve to accelerate the new. The old accelerators actually accelerate even more. And that's why adoption happens as S-curves. Because when the old brakes don't work, and the accelerators do, then adoption increases exponentially. So the new emerges with higher level of capabilities, and many times at a lower cost per unit, and the old essentially crashes. So the new eventually becomes the new equilibrium. So think about electric vehicles and so on. They're going to become a new equilibrium. But it's not what you think. It's not a one-to-one substitution, because that's a phase change disruption. But that new system will become a new equilibrium with new rules and new dynamics and new patterns. So let's start with how to understand how disruptions happen. Let's start with technology cost curves. So back in 2014, I published a book called Clean Disruption of Energy and Transportation. And I published this exact cost curve for lithium-ion batteries out to 2030. And you can't imagine how I was trolled for publishing that. $125 per kilowatt hour by 2022, it's never going to happen. What are you smoking, right? And here we are. It's been almost exactly what I forecast. Cost curves are like gravity. I don't care what your opinion is. Cost curves are like gravity. They will happen. The cost curve of lithium-ion batteries is going exactly as I predicted. But the big disruptions, the phase change disruptions, happen because of something that I call technology convergence. Now, what is a convergence? Let's go back to 2007, when both the iPhone and Android basically became possible. Both of them happened the same year, 2007. But why not 2003 or 2010? Why 2007? That's because the technologies that made a $600 smartphone possible essentially converged 2007. And that's when Apple and Google came into the space and essentially developed a smartphone, and now they're both multi-trillion-dollar companies. So technology convergence opens up the possibility space. The other lesson is that neither Apple nor Google had ever built a phone before. So disruptions, the phase change disruptions, happen from the edge, not from the center. The incumbents at the time, Motorola, remember them? BlackBerry, remember them? They could have got into the space, but they did not see it coming. Microsoft did not see it coming. They actually dismissed the smartphone loudly. So this is the technology convergence. And if you look at that, the adoption of the smartphone happened as an S-curve. So I've been following a number of key technologies for many years, and these technologies are a subset of the ones that in convergence at different sectors at different times are essentially disrupting everything over the next 10, 15 years. When a possibility space opens up, new business model innovation also becomes possible, not only new products. So think about Uber, which was started in an apartment here in San Francisco in 2009, exactly 2 years after the iPhone came out. Is that coincidence? Not at all. 2 years after. That's because the iPhone opened up the possibility space for ride-hailing. Actually, the iPhone and the internet and so on. So, and if you think about it, Uber had more bookings than the whole taxi industry in America within just 7 years. And that's another lesson. Disruptions in foundational sectors like transportation or energy do happen very quickly. In this case, 7 years. They disrupted the taxi industry in America. And that's not all. Of course, they've gone on to disrupt other industries. And S-curve, market adoption S-curve. Technology adoption always happens as S-curves if they're successful. If not, they just crash, right? So back to the car and the horse. In 13 years, we saw those pictures in New York City. At the level of the United States of America, adoption of the car went from essentially nil to about 95% of miles within 20 years. And it happened as an S-curve. But that's not the big thing. it went from about 10% to about 80% in just 10 years, in just one decade. In just one decade, the bulk of that transportation disruption happened despite building those two industries, the auto industry and the oil industry, despite building a new road infrastructure, despite fighting World War I and the meanest influenza pandemic in history. So despite all of these things, the bulk of the major transportation disruption of the 20th century happened, the bulk, within 10 years. So anyone who tells you that major disruptions cannot happen in 10 to 15 years is not looking at the evidence. We have uncovered dozens of cases in many industries throughout time of disruptions that have happened in 10 to 15 years, from healthcare to materials, to transportation, energy, and so on. And if anything, S-curves are accelerating disruptions that may have taken decades in the past. Now they're taking place in years, maybe even months. So again, anyone who tells you that a major disruption cannot happen in 10 to 15 years is not looking at the evidence. And the mainstream keeps pushing this linearity. I mean, the EIA, look at their forecasts, 20 years of forecasts in solar PV. Every year they've been wrong by 30 to 40% because they just extrapolate. They draw a straight line into the future and they say this is the adoption of solar until 2040 or 2050, just a straight line. But never ever is adoption of new technologies, never ever are disruptions linear. They're S-curves, right? So if you look at the green line, which is reality, it's starting to look like an S-curve. That's solar PV. And the opposite is true, the collapse. So if you look at some of the forecasts for coal in America by the US Department of Energy, essentially every year they're saying that coal is going to flatten. So they draw a flat line into the future. But in fact, if you look at the black dots, coal is collapsing as it should, as an inverted S-curve, right? So the reality is that adoption takes place as S-curves of the new, and collapse of the old also happens as S-curves, as inverted S-curves. So here's the question. Why do smart people in smart organizations, very smart people, former entrepreneurs, billionaires, and so on, fail to anticipate and let alone lead market disruptions? The incumbent mindset, linear, reductionist, mechanistics, they just don't see new opportunity spaces open up. They just extrapolate from the present into a future that is essentially a mirage, plus or minus, right, with incremental changes. And like I said, disruptions don't work that way. And that's why these companies collapse. And when they do, they collapse very quickly. And I call that market trauma. And market trauma means that financial collapse can happen early, quickly, and disproportionately. So if you think about General Electric, one of the premier industrial companies of the 20th century, essentially GE Power collapsed in 2018. Even though solar, wind, and batteries were just a couple of % of the market, right? They did not see the quick adoption, but the collapse of their valuation happened very quickly. The stock market valuation dropped by more than 70% in a year, and it has never really recovered. One of the premier industrial companies of the 20th century, which had all the information in the world. They were in the wind turbine market, and they did not see the disruption. So phase change disruption leads to new systems with new properties. And this is what's happening in food, energy, transportation, information, materials, and so on. These are not just substitutions of the old. These are brand new systems, right? So back to the car and the horse. We saw that from the early 1900s to about 1925, the car over 20 years went from almost nil to about 95% of the market. And of course, the market share of the horse collapsed as an inverted S-curve. But at the time, Ford famously said that if he had asked what the market wanted, they said a faster horse. To them, the car was a faster horse, right? It was a one-to-one substitution of the horse, only faster. But we know that is not the case, right? The car transportation system was a brand new system, new properties, new dynamics, new metrics, new size. Even by the late 2020s, the car market was hundreds of times larger than the horse market ever was. And it created a whole new system, and not just in transportation. We built the 20th century around car and oil, right? And electricity. But the car changed everything in the 20th century, not just for transportation. It changed everything for society. We built cities around the car. We built, the geopolitics of the 20th century were based on petroleum, still are, if you think about it, right? And the petroleum, of course, was the source of energy for the internal combustion engine car. Governance changed, politics changed, the economy changed because of the car. So these are phase change disruptions with cascading ripple effects across society. So a way to think about it is that a butterfly is not a faster caterpillar. It's a new system. It's a new life form, if you will. And if you think that you can add wings to a caterpillar and you have a butterfly, well, that's what a lot of incumbents think, right? But again, a butterfly is not a caterpillar with wings, right? It needs to go through a phase transformation to become a butterfly. And when it does, it can fly. It's a new system with new metrics, new properties. It eats different, it behaves differently, right? So tastes and preferences change because of phase change transformations. So when the car disrupted the horse, what happened to all those horses that were disrupted? We ate them. Now, not you and me, of course, but we ate them. Transportation became food. Think about it. Think about how preferences and tastes change, right? So the smartphone, the internet, and the cloud did not just disrupt information technology, which of course they did. They actually, if you think about the car itself, they're unbundling the value of the car, of the individually owned car. And I'll come back to that later. So the value for our parents of the car included things like dating and mating, right? But we don't need a car for that anymore. We have dating apps, right? We used to go to the movies. Now we can stream, right? We used to eat at restaurants and we needed cars to take us there. We don't anymore, right? Groceries, we have delivery. Work, Now we work from home, at least some of the time. And more that's going to be the case. So a lot of the sources of value of the individually owned car are being destroyed by information technology, and that's happening today, and that happened even before the major disruption of transportation.